an hour for each paper. So we allow for 20 presentation, 20 minutes, and then 5-10 minutes for discussants, and then we have Q&A at the very end. There's also Q&A at the bottom of the screen, so you can use that, ask your questions, and if co-authors are present, then you might get a reply during the presentation. Otherwise, we can save it for the Q&A at the very end. Time is short, so let's get started. The first presenter is you, Takao, so the time is yours.
Let me, Okay. All right. Thank you very much for the for organizing this really interesting session. And so this is a joint work with Yukiko and LERA. They're all here on the panel. And so the starting point is it's Claudia's famous AEA address. So in a nutshell, she's telling us that if you want to know about the remaining gender wage gap, we need to pay attention to those occupations or fields where the returns to long and inflexible working hours is quite high. And then there's a series of studies following this, and we are now accumulating a number of really good evidence on this, this idea. And some of the papers are written by some people on this panel. So just to recap, for some occupations in a nutshell, the attaining high-paying jobs really require long working hours, but the married women tend to allocate disproportionately more hours to household production. So this becomes an entry barrier for women to advance careers. So the obvious question is, what frees up women's time so that they can overcome this kind of long working hour barrier for high-paying jobs? It's a really interesting paper recently, and Jolie and Patricia and Jessica Penn. Growing availability of low-cost immigrants workers really free up those married women's time at home, so that really helps the narrowing gender gap. So this paper really, essentially begin with a very simple idea. What if their husbands, instead of immigrants, in their rat race promotion tournament with long working hours, get eliminated from the tournament and become available for household production? Would that really help? That's really the question we'd like to answer here. And I hope we have some preliminary new evidence to suggest that there is a link between the husband's long working hours or participation in the rat race promotion tournament and women's wives' career advancement. So what we do, specifically, we're going to use the panel data from Japan's labor force survey, and we're going to estimate the probability that the married women change their status, career status, when their husbands gets eliminated from promotion tournament. And how to define the elimination is a really difficult question. We're going to get to it. But before doing that, just why Japan? Right? There are two reasons. One reason is actually, if you want to study something like this, what would the women's career, what would the women do when the husbands get out from this long working hour promotion tournament? Japan is a really good case to study because the long working hours is really, the prevalence of long working hours is pretty astonishing in Japan. And also there's some studies showing that that's really the result of a rat race promotion tournament. So here's a simple picture which tells us how salient long working hours are in Japan. So this is for all men and women aged 22 to 65. And the percent of people who work 50 or more hours per week. And then for men, it's ranging between 35 to 40%. This is not just select group of people. This is everybody. So the long working hours is indeed very prevalent in Japan. For women, it's less than 10%. So there's a significant gender gap as well in terms of the incidence of long working hours. So the second reason why Japan is actually a good place to go when we are interested in something like this, the so-called target of 30% by 2020, which is really increasing the share of women in leadership positions to at least 30% by 2020, which just ended, in all fields in society in Japan. This is really a target and an objective that the Prime Minister Shinzo Abe, who recently resigned due to health issues, and it really did a lot of things to achieve something like this. However, Japan failed to achieve the target. So now it's renewed. The current Prime Minister essentially announced recently that, okay, we're going to try to do this by 2030. So Japan got 10 more years of extension. Okay. Now, this really tells us that this promoting women's advancement in the labor market has been a top policy priority in Japan. At the same time, it has proven to be really difficult to achieve. So it really urgent need to understand why that's the case. Their deep understanding of the nature, scope, and causes of gender gaps in promotion in the workplace is really important for Japanese policymakers. All right, so I know the others already warned me that he's going to cut me off when the time comes. So I'm going to give you a preview so that we can all relax, and some of you can read the paper if this interests you. So essentially what we do here is, what would the married women do in terms of their career when their husbands exit from their rat race promotion tournament and stop working long hours? So we found some interesting statistically significant effects of that change in the husband's career status. Number one is, so the married women who's initially working, but not on the promotion track. So, and we're going to define exactly what the promotion track really means, but essentially, good example would be maybe working part-time as a grocery store and with really no prospect for promotion, something like this. Those women are more likely to become, to be on the promotion track. With career prospects. So that change, status change, is indeed identified by our estimation. And number two is that status change actually takes place both on the extensive margin and an intensive margin. Extensive margin is really an employment status change. I'm going to give you more detail about this, but Japan has a sort of dual labor market. So the people who are employed as standard employees, say Shiny, really enjoy a lot of benefits and so forth, and definitely can be a contestant for promotion tournament. But if you're employed as non-standard employees, you're not really a contestant for promotion tournament. So that status change did occur as a result of the husband's status changes. So that's extensive margin, but also intensive margin. Wives were working as standard employees, but not working long hours enough to be a contestant for promotion tournament. They increased their working hours substantially to become a contestant. Number three is there's we call it traditional marriage. So the married woman who was initially a full-time homemaker, we did find that the women is less likely to maintain the homemaker status and start working. Now the question is, they really actually jump to the employment on the promotion track or some kind of non-standard employees? But we did find, although the effects are not very big, some evidence that those full-time homemakers actually jump to the to be on the promotion track. Standard employees working longer working hours. Okay, then there are relatively small percentage of Japanese married women who are actually already on the promotion track. And what happened to them if their rat racing husband gets eliminated from the promotion tournament? Now, there's a theory out there and some evidence showing that so-called joint consumption of the household public good. When the husband stopped working long hours, women also stopped working long hours, start enjoying leisure together. We didn't find that. We did not find that evidence. So instead, those married women are more likely to stay on the promotion track when their husbands exit. The last thing, we did a little bit of heterogeneity exercise, heterogeneous effects, and we found that this kind of wife's response to the husband's exit more pronounced for highly educated women, and then less pronounced for occupation with low return to long hour working hours, such as scientists and the technology workers, and which is consistent with the Claudia Golden's argument. So, okay, so now the nuts and bolts. Okay, so so we're going to focus on the age 22 to 54 married women and their husbands, and the 2003 to 2017. This labor force survey has got the panel feature, which is the same workers are followed as 4 times, March and April of the year, and then a year later, March and April again. So we have 4 data points for each person. One drawback of labor force survey is that we don't have usual hours. Instead, we have actual hours. So to overcome this, we actually essentially use this. Okay, if the work hour changes occur in 2 consecutive time period, that's probably a close to usual hour change, not the temporary shocks. So that's what we did. Okay. Now, so the actual key question here is, who is on the promotion track? Now, we're going to use our institutional knowledge of the Japanese employment system. Number one is you have to be standard employees to be on the promotion track. So that's one necessary condition. The second condition is, again, we're going to build on this rat race promotion tournament as applied to the Japanese promotion system. And essentially, the contestant needs to continue to send a credible signal of it's a relatively low cost of working long hours consistently, and the commitment to the companies by actually working long hours consistently. So this is the idea. So it's a signal, working long hours. So what sort of a long hours will be a sufficient credible a signal here? We don't have any good answer to that question at this point. But what we do, we're going to try 3 different definitions, see if the results change. So 50 plus, 55 plus, 60 plus. And then just in the end, the results, it really didn't change, whichever definition we use. Okay. And all right. The one thing that I really need to mention here, okay, let's move on. And so more specifically, so we're going to just look at those married women whose husbands are employed as standard employees and working 50 or more hours per week initially. So this is the couples, and then in which husband is actually on the promotion track. And then when that husband exit from the promotion track, what happened to the wives? That's sort of what we're going to do here. But we need to divide those married women into 3 groups, 3 types, initial conditions. The one is in traditional marriage. So yeah, husband is pursuing the promotion on the promotion track, but the wife is a full-time homemaker. Okay. The second type is I will call it modern marriage. Don't have a good terminology here, but modern marriage means the woman is actually working, but not as standard employees. So not on the promotion track, or even in a standard employee, not working long enough to be a contestant for promotion track. So that's the That's a modern women in modern marriage. And then we have a power couple marriage. So this is a woman who is actually employed as standard employees and working 50 or more hours. Okay. And then for each group of women, we actually estimate the dynamic response of the wife to husband's status change from on the track to off the track. Now, so the key right-hand side variable here is the husband off track. In other words, when the husband was initially working 2 consecutive time period, 50 or more hours as standard employees. And then the subsequent to consecutive period, either they're no longer employed as standard employees, in other words, became non-standard employees, or even maintain a standard employment status, working less than 50 hours per week for 2 consecutive periods. We consider that to be the husband getting changes its status from on the promotion track to the off the promotion track. Now we look at the sort of a summary statistics of those husbands who actually change this switch, change the status. The average age is a little like a 42. And that's really consistent with what we know about the Japanese promotion ladder. And it's really around that time people get eliminated from the promotion tournament. So this is consistent with what we know about the Japanese promotion system. And also we look at the average drop in the number of working hours for those people who switch their status. You know, if it's only going from 51 to 49, just not a big deal, but it turns out it's a 20-hour drop coming from 67 hours on average. So on average, those Japanese men working more than 50 hours, they're actually working 67 hours per week. And then they got the huge drop of 20 hours. So this is a pretty substantial change that we're picking up. And then they suddenly become more available for household production, right? So this is the actual estimation, it's fine. So this just summarizes what we did. So each of these women, homemaker, off the promotion track, on the promotion track, we have the transition matrix, right? For homemaker, this is status quo. You stay, even if the husband get out of the promotion tournament, homemaker's wife will stay in the same position or become off the promotion track workers or on the promotion track workers. So we got this transition here. So what we're doing here is essentially odds of the women who end up with each of those 3 categories as a function of husband off track. That's what we essentially did. So the results here is, the first one is, so you have 3 groups, right? Traditional marriage, modern marriage, power couple. So if you look at traditional marriage, when the household husband get out of the promotion tournament, there will be a significant, modest increase in the odds of their full-time homemaker to become the on-track workers. In other words, the married woman jumps from full-time home worker to the contestant for promotion tournament. It's significant. It's a small change. So we did find something like this, but probably the most important one is here: modern marriage. Half of Japanese couples, married couples, fall into this group, by the way. And so this is both are working, but the wives are working as non-standard employees, not long hours. Do they change their status? The answer is yes. A significant, substantial increase in the odds of those women to become a contestant for promotion tournament.
I have a few minutes.
Few minutes. Okay, that's good. I'm almost done. So the power couples, actually the odds of becoming off track. In other words, so okay, the husbands stop working long hours. I'm going to stop working long hours as well. So maybe I'll become non-standard employees. That odds actually went down. So the power couple women are more likely to stick to their promotion track when the husbands get out. So that's the key results. And then what we did here is intensive margin, extensive margin for those group of more than marriage. And so just not going into the detail, what we found here is, yes, both. Those working women, married women, switch their status from non-standard to standard. That did happen. Also, the standard employees who also increase the number of hours, go beyond the 50 plus to qualify for promotion track. And then the last thing we did is heterogeneity. So without getting into some details here, again, what we did, okay, let's just look at some occupations where we know that the returns to long working hours tends to be small. So the technology and science is something that we look at, and then you interact that with the husband off track exit. For what we found here is definitely for the power couple marriage. So the wives are also working on the promotion track. They actually did reduce the number. They become off the track, off the promotion track. So here, these people, we did find this joint consumption of leisure results that we were talking about earlier. All right. So, but last thing is college. Again, we did find that the wife's response to her husband's exit from the promotion tournament is more pronounced for four-year degree, highly educated women, which makes perfect sense. Okay, I'm going to stop here. I don't need to summarize. I've already given a preview. Okay.
Yeah, thank you, Takao.
Let me stop. Okay, there we go.
William?
Thank you, and thank you, Takao and Rui, for this fascinating paper. The challenge that Japan has faced because of its declining population growth is how to increase women's labor force participation to make up for that so that they can continue to have labor force participation grow. And it's been fascinating because in just the raw numbers, labor force participation, Japan has been doing quite well. And despite people believing there was some cultural issue here, Japan now exceeds the United States for women's labor force participation. So this paper is fascinating because it gets us deeper into the issues of the nature of that labor force participation and lets us look at what's the full contribution and whether we're just pumping up participation. Are we really pumping up engagement? I found the paper to be interesting because I think for those of us who don't have great detail on the institution of the promotion track in Japan, this concept is different and enlightening. What I thought would have been helpful, because clearly we know from the paper for men that the promotion track competition reaches some crucial point when you get to the 40s, and one has to assume that the age of the wife and the age of the husband may matter. And so it would have been fascinating to see the results based on age differences. Is part of the take up of women to go into the promotion track more prevalent if the women are younger, and therefore there's a clear chance that now once in the tournament they may win, or whether the power couples, particularly where they both appear to be college educated and therefore probably closer in age, it becomes let's both get off the track.
Good point.
It would have been fascinating to see issues around childbearing and the role that played as an interaction with this, because part of the belief that many people had that it was cultural was that the Japanese family structure just wouldn't work when children were present. And so it would have been fascinating to see if there were real differences between the power couples and the non-power couples when it came to children, and the extent to which the public policy to try and address this of expanding childcare might have influenced this response, since lower earning women would have had access to childcare and made it easier for them to make decisions about increasing their hours, whereas before you really would have had to have been a very high earner in Japan in order to have had access to childcare as an option within the traditional framework. I think this is really just a fascinating paper for getting us into the particular nature of institutions and how they interface with strategies, and a better picture than we get from just the top line, looking only at labor force participation. It's clear to make up for the decline in population that Japan is going to have to figure out how to increase women's contribution, not just participation. So I think this was a very good paper. Thank you.
Thank you, William. Let me add one more question before you get the opportunity to reply to Takao.
Sure.
I like the idea about the tournament model, and I think it's particularly interesting or useful in the Japanese context. But for me, the benchmark model is the household labor supply model. And I was just thinking, how far would you be able to go if you use that as the model? And then what is the add-on by using the tournament model? So I think it would, help us understand better what is actually going on in Japan if you could benchmark to that model. So you have a few minutes to go.
Sure. The Yukiko, you want to respond to the childcare issue? Yukiko is an expert on the Japanese childcare. I'm quite sure do you want to unmute and go ahead, Yukiko? Go ahead.
Yeah. So I could definitely look at the child birth rate in the future analysis. That's actually a good idea, and it's very important. Thank you for suggesting that. Sorry, I think we could do it, but we haven't
sure.
done so far. Yeah.
Yeah, so just to follow up on this, Yukiko has a number of really important papers about the effects of childcare policy on the women's career advancement, and they, in a nutshell, they don't work well. not a huge impact. So I think this paper is telling. We're trying to tell a story that there's no silver bullet here, and you can't just focus on the women's sort of working hours. You really need to look at husbands' working hours. So in other words, you really need to look at the entire Japanese employment system. I think that's the reason why it's really hard to change this. They've been trying for 40 years to do this, and still we're far from 30% target. It's a 14% currently. It did improve, but it's far from 30% goal. So I think that's really the issue. The age difference, excellent point, and we can certainly look at it. We should do that. And that actually really reveals some really a challenge for us. If the Japanese labor market is characterized by the very well developed internal labor markets, then the entering the internal labor market at age 40 is really tough. So what form those women take to become a contestant, that's a really big question. We are grappling with that. Where do they go? Maybe there are some new multinational corporations which just don't do the traditional long, well-developed internal labor market, so they will accept Japanese women in mid-30s and even 40s to join a career track. We have some anecdotes about this, and so that might be what's happening here. And there's going to the labor supply model. Yeah, definitely. There's typically what happened is, so for example, the husbands suddenly lose their jobs or something like this. And then there's added worker effects there. And so there is a literature on this, and there's some interesting recent paper on this. We're actually taking the sort of a slightly different, so really a tournament model. And we're not really arguing that the tournament model is more valid than the standard household labor supply model. So essentially, this is an alternative way of looking at the women's labor supply in conjunction with the Japanese sort of internal labor markets. Okay, that's enough for me. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Takao. So I think that we're moving on to the next paper now. So the next paper is by Julie and Colleen. So Julie.
Can you see my screen?
Yes.
So first, I just want to thank everyone for joining us today, and the chair and the discussants and the other authors. I'm excited to share this research with you and discuss the other papers that are here today. This is work that Colleen and I are working on at the University of Minnesota. And so, let's jump into it here. So these are just a few of the headlines that highlight the double bind and subsequent bias that women often face in the workplace. And so although, as we've heard, and we know, a large portion of the gender wage gap in the United States and other areas can be explained by such factors as occupation and career interruptions, there's still a fairly, there's still a part of the gender gap that is unexplained. And this leaves open the possibility that bias could contribute to the pay penalty for women as well. So we know for professionally and highly educated women where the gender pay gap tends to be larger and more stable, that one explanation for the gap is that women in traditionally male roles, managerial roles and professional contexts, experience a likability penalty, which impacts their pay. We also know, and there's recent research that has found that contrary to this pay penalty, both men and women who are primary breadwinners benefit from a premium relative to workers who are dual breadwinners or secondary earners. And this is even after controlling for performance measures at the firm. And I'll unpack that part, the performance part, a bit more later. So the research question here then is that, as the primary breadwinner role itself is rooted in a conception of traditional gender roles, whether women benefit from being the primary breadwinner, as we've seen in previous research, may actually vary based on how salient the traditional gender norms are in their work context. So to explore this interaction of breadwinner role and context, we ask, are the effects of the breadwinner role on pay different for men and women in a masculine context? And do the effects vary? And another way to approach the question is, do the effects vary by the intensity of the masculine context, whether it's more or less masculine? And as women are increasingly more common as primary breadwinners in their households, examining if and when pay penalties impact them is an important next step in the gender pay gap research. And so this research that I'm presenting today makes three contributions. First, more research is needed to examine mechanisms of the pay difference for both men and women primary breadwinners specifically, as this research on primary breadwinners has traditionally used male-only samples. And second, more research is needed to draw out this cultural link between breadwinner roles and masculine contexts. And finally, reframing gender violation penalty research to include household roles encompasses the multiple roles that are present in the workplace and can shed important light on the study of gender and career rewards in general. So sort of the premise of the paper is, why is the breadwinner role theorized as associated with pay in the first place? And so I'll just, briefly sort of go over some of the conceptual foundations here. Prior work theorizes that the breadwinner role is the result of intra-household bargaining. That's one perspective. And so this idea is that those with a higher relative career priority in the household among married couples or partnered couples are expected to do less household labor and have more household resources to support their career, thus facilitating their productivity in the workplace. However, this distinction between actual and perceived resources in the workplace and how they facilitate productivity is less clear and leaves us some room here to talk about that difference. So according to this inter-household bargaining perspective, the breadwinner role signals relative career priority and associated household resources, which should signal the level of the effort available for work, which should translate into productivity at work. And this justifies a corresponding pay premium. As the recent research on primary breadwinners, gender neutral effect of primary breadwinners has found though, the primary breadwinner premium persists in professional settings, even after controlling for firm measured performance. So this suggests that the primary breadwinner premium may highlight the difficulty of measuring productivity in professional settings, where tasks are often unstandardized or team-based, and this results in a need to rely on proxies for productivity, such as perceptions of productivity. And these are most often aligned with the ideal worker norm in these professional contexts, which is a conception of the unencumbered worker. So perceptions, as we know, however, may differ by gender for the same role, particularly when gender norms are salient. So the effectiveness of this breadwinner role as a signal of household resources may be context dependent. And as the cultural link between breadwinner roles and men is strongest in what are traditionally considered male jobs, the primary breadwinner women in masculine contexts may be more likely to activate gender bias. And so in terms of the mechanism of this gender bias activation, and I won't go into too much detail here because we can't and we're not testing mechanisms in this field study, but as previous experimental research has found, that the likability does impact judgments of women in the workplace. And so this likability penalty is theorized as rooted in often a lack of fit penalty and or a status role threat penalty. So this brings us to the hypotheses for this field study, because we know that from the likability penalty research that perceptions matter in a work context, particularly for women. And prior research demonstrates that supervisor perceptions impact supervisor action towards employees, such as through career reward decisions. Thus, we expect that the primary breadwinner pay premium will be less for women than for men in a masculine context due to this likability penalty. And that the differences in pay premiums will be less for women than for men in higher masculine contexts relative to lower masculine contexts. So to study this and to examine these hypotheses using data from a survey that was at one organization that was collected in 2019, it was a large multinational company in a traditionally male-dominated industry. And the survey invitations were mailed to just over 4,000 employees, and we had a 62% response rate. And some of the advantages of this sample that I'll just point out is that we were able to gather pretty rich information about household responsibilities and roles. And then we're able to link it with administrative records of pay and performance. And since all of these employees come from one organization, they're in a single setting with a shared evaluation and reward structure. So the way that we constructed the breadwinner role for this study is we surveyed married employees, so the sample is all married employees, about their dual career status. And so yes is a dual breadwinner and no is a sole breadwinner. And their career priority, and then the second question we used was their career priority relative to their spouse within the household, and that was on a scale of 1 to 5, with 1 being low and 5 is the career with a much higher career priority relative to their spouse. And we do this to control for career motivation and household resources by restricting the sample to those with 4 and 5 relative career priority in the household for both the sole and dual breadwinners, which is why we call the dual breadwinners dual priority. We don't include the equal priority or lower career priority in the analysis. And this is an important distinction because often dual career employees are assumed to be in an egalitarian household where they split resources more or less 50-50. So here you can see the distribution of the breadwinner role by gender. And you can see that both men and women have a higher proportion of dual priority than sole breadwinners. However, it's worth noting that men have a higher proportion of sole breadwinners, around 43%, whereas women have, their proportion is about 28%. So let me just give you quickly a brief overview and a few more details about this sample. On average, you can see the overall salary range is fairly high. It's a male-dominated organization and is predominantly white. Again, this is an all-married sample and 87% are parents. The majority, over 85%, have a college degree or higher, and over 80% are in the average or meets expectation performance category for both task and behavioral performance measures. And then the last two control variables are household responsibility variables. And here we captured the sort of the mental labor that goes into household work, and that's the household planning variable. And then the household care represents the more direct physical care and time spent on household work. So we do just ordinary least squares multiple regression to test the hypotheses, and due to the skewed distribution of pay, we use a natural log of annual salary as the dependent variable, and our control variables include vectors for demographics, human capital, performance, and household responsibilities, and I'll go through those a little bit more as we go on here. So this is just this figure is an overview of a visual of the results, and it's the predicted salary for each breadwinner role category by gender, using the means for all the other covariates. And as we can see, the slope from sole breadwinner to dual priority is different for men than for women. And so men, you see that there is this sole breadwinner premium, and for women, it's actually more of a penalty. So I'll go into the regression results a little bit more here. You can see that after, well, I just want to mention that after including covariates, the final sample was about 742 employees nested within 425 managers who provided the performance ratings. And the survey responses are for 1 year, 2019, combined with 5 years of performance and pay data. And so you can see in model 1 that we see the gender effect with women earning less than men in terms of salary. And then as we layer in the control variables, the female coefficient remains significant and negative. And so this finding replicates prior evidence of an overall gender pay gap after accounting for differences between men and women. And you can see when we look at the breadwinner role, we see that the sole breadwinner on average earns more relative to the dual priority breadwinners. And this is also statistically significant. And this premium is maintained after the control variables are layered in. And so this is consistent with the previous research on employee breadwinner role and pay, that there is a sole breadwinner or primary breadwinner premium. Now, to assess for hypothesis 1, we include an interaction between female and breadwinner to see if the premium for sole breadwinner varies by gender. And in model 7, we see that when we add in the interaction term between female and breadwinner role, we find evidence that the sole breadwinner women do not benefit as much as men, as we saw in the figure, and it is negative in significance and statistically significant. And these findings support hypothesis 1, that the sole breadwinner premium is less for women than for men in a masculine context. So for hypothesis 2, we want to look within the organization and compare more and less masculine context. So how do we do this in the organization? Well, based on interaction with the company, we had some feedback that there are distinct subcultures within the main business units related to leadership style and diversity priorities. And we were able to support this qualitative feedback with an analysis for an index variable we had in the survey on support for household specialization. So if you had a higher score on that, that unit was more supportive of household specialization, which we considered a more traditional attitude, and a lower score on it would be less supportive of household specialization, when we would consider that a more progressive attitude. So the corporate group represents units at that were at the corporate headquarters, and that's potentially closer to corporate initiated diversity and inclusion efforts, and they scored lower on the supporting household specialization index. And then we had the progressive group, which had units that have leadership that are proactive with diversity and inclusion efforts and are interested in change, and they scored lower also on the supporting household specialization variable. And then the traditional group maintain, the feedback from the company is that that leadership tends to maintain the status quo and do not actively engage in diversity and inclusion efforts. And these groups also scored higher on so they scored higher on the household specialization index variable, suggesting that they do have more traditional attitudes in those business units. So by using these 3 units, we're able to, we would split the sample for a fully interacted model, and we're able to look and see if these higher and lower masculine groups, because we consider the traditional group as a higher masculine subculture, as because it perpetuates and it supports the status quo of the company, and that the corporate and progressive groups were less traditionally masculine, as they're more open to diversity, inclusion, and change. And so we can see here that we do find statistically significant evidence that sole breadwinner women don't benefit as much as men do in the traditional unit compared to the other 2 groups. So that's just a summary of the results there. So by finding now that women benefit less than men from the sole breadwinner premium in this field study, and this differs from recent research showing that there's no gender difference in the premium. And given the hypothesized effect is found by comparing within the organization, both between high and low masculine business units, and then also that this field data comes from a male-dominated industry, this suggests that one reason that the primary breadwinner premiums are different for women is because of the masculine context. However, we cannot draw causal inferences from this data because it is just one context, and it is observational data. And so we don't know for sure that it's due to this masculine nature of the organizational context. So future research experimental research can tease apart these dimensions of the masculine culture that may trigger this gender bias for women, and how they influence the perception of sole and primary breadwinner women and men differentially in a masculine context. So that's all I have today. I didn't notice if there were any questions that came up during. Okay.
We can get to that later. Thank you so much for staying within time. So let's move on to you, William, your comments and discussion.
Thank you. I think this paper partners with the first paper very well. Even though in the US we don't think of these things in the same context, in the formal context as we saw in Japan with people working 50 hours, but we do know that is what goes on in the US as well. And so a signal that the sole breadwinner often is able to have, or the dominant earner may have, compared to the partner who's doing more of the domestic production, is they can do the 50 hours. So then the issue becomes, what's the perception? So is the perception, because of the gendered economy, that this is a bad woman? Because why is she not at home? Why is she here at the office with us for 50 hours? This is not a good woman. So that's the likability factor that you were talking about. Does a woman become unlikable because she signals that she's willing to work as hard as men? And then the issue you raise of, is this an institutional structure? The way in which institutional racism or institutional misogyny is expressed. We don't, and the paper is very important for that reason, because in order to understand institutional structures, it doesn't do to look at earnings so much as these structures. That is, I keep you out. There are barriers that keep you out of where you should not be. Now, that accomplishes a lot. But then the problem becomes, what if you get over the barrier? Now you are in no man's land because you don't belong here. We did everything we could to keep you out. And golly, here you are. What are you doing here? Now we must really punish you. And so it's not in a way, when you think of it as and this is the key to understanding institutional discrimination. Institutional discrimination is this extra layer, this we've done everything else to keep you out, and here you are. So so you're finding that even when women are doing everything right according to the rules, that they then encounter, no, this is where the discrimination becomes raw and naked, because you aren't where you are supposed to be. Can we influence it? And your paper appears to suggest, well, maybe we can have a different culture. Maybe the progressive structure isn't simply that they're more open, but maybe the signaling of working 50 hours or 60 hours isn't the decision-making for promotions. Maybe it's a different setting in which the playing field is more level, and this animosity towards someone who either isn't pulling the hours, or the resentment that a woman is pulling hours when we don't think that's good for women to do, that sort of machismo attitude. But I did find fascinating in your regression that in the progressive equation, the white coefficient was significant and positive, and in the traditional, it wasn't, which made me think, is there either some intersectionality going on here? Is it somehow or another that in the progressive setting that there is a differentiation between Black and white women? And what does that intersection look like? And then on the traditional side, is this a makeup? Is there an additional barrier within the traditional setting where there are just not that many non-whites? And so any extra penalty is really not necessary because they're insignificant to this internal competition that's going on for promotion. So it sort of begged, is there something else going on between the traditional and the more progressive part of the company? And so I thought that would be an interesting avenue to pursue, so that you might think, can I treat this as an experiment? And might it be that because you appear to have access to administrative records, there's some point where someone or some group is arbitrarily chosen, or you could posit that they have been, so that you might be able to do this as a real treatment effect between those who get selected to be in the progressive versus the traditional. Because the data, at least from my perception of your results, it was suggesting that there may be this extra barrier that the traditional group is doing, that these folks aren't really randomly selected, that the traditional group is putting up these extra barriers that maybe it would be interesting to explore. But I think the two papers are very helpful together because they speak to this internal culture of work and promotion in these very specific kind of settings.
Yeah, thank you for those comments. That's really helpful and interesting, and the intersection with other with race and other demographics, I think, is a very important point, and something that we want to explore, and future research needs to explore as well. And the idea that there's something extra going on in the traditional group is interesting, and I think that's part of what we're looking forward to in study 2, is trying to tease apart these different dimensions of culture and what what specifically is more likely to trigger these effects than others. And so sort of teasing apart that the elements and dimensions of this masculine culture. Colleen, did you have any thoughts or anything to add?
I think it's really helpful. I think, yeah, just this idea that the likability penalty in terms of violating expectations of what good women should be, and kind of how that is this, issue for women who may be taking on more masculine roles in the workplace. Does that then undermine them due to perceptions of low likability? So yeah, so I think your comments are really helpful in thinking about the institutional aspects of institutional sexism and the role of culture. So yeah, appreciate it.
We're opening up for questions now, but I can start. I'm curious, what is it that the firm is trying to get out of this? I mean, it's kind of an unusual survey to run in a masculine company. So what is it that they're looking for? Do you know that?
Well, they were having gender differences in their annual survey that they were typically doing. So they were finding emergence of gender differences and perceptions of career advancement and kind of other areas around diversity and leadership. And so they asked us, so this was just kind of a few questions. We had more questions around, diversity and how leaders communicated about diversity, but that's kind of not within the scope of this project, but we were able to include this. Dual careers are important for this organization because there's a lot of expectations around mobility. And so that was a question that they had is, how are dual career couples faring if there's expectations for relocation, in order to advance.
Do we have more questions coming in? I don't see any in the Q&A. Do we have any questions from the panelists? Okay, we can move on to the third paper, and then we might take additional questions at the end. So let's move on to Melanie.
Okay, great. Can everyone see and hear me and see the slides?
Yes.
Okay, excellent. So thanks so much for the opportunity to be a part of this session. I'm really excited to share with you my joint work with Brendan Price entitled The Summer Drop in Female Labor Supply. Here's the kind of standard disclaimer from the Fed at the bottom of the slide. And then I also want to highlight that this is our first time presenting this paper, and so we especially welcome your feedback and questions. So there are well-documented differences by gender in labor supply, many of which have been the topic of other papers in this session. So we see these gender differences in labor supply on the extensive margin. So women are less likely to participate in the labor force. They are more likely to experience career interruptions throughout their life cycle than are men. We also see these gender differences on the intensive margin. So women on average work fewer hours per week than men, are less likely to engage in overtime work, are less likely to work 50+ hours per week, as mentioned by Takao. We also see gender differences in the timing of hours worked per week in terms of women tending to work more conventional hours than men. These gender differences in labor supply have been attributed to actual conflicts between work and family obligations, in particular, the effect of having a child on female labor force participation and hours worked. These gender differences have also been attributed to anticipated or future conflicts between work and family obligations, where women may be sorting into jobs, occupations, or sectors, anticipating that in the future, they may be taking on a disproportionate share of childcare obligations. And so they're kind of demanding certain temporal flexibility from their jobs or occupations accordingly. And, consistent with the notion that female labor supply is kind of constrained by childcare obligations, there is some evidence, although, as we talked about earlier, this evidence is a bit mixed, that female labor supply rises when there's increased availability of childcare or schooling, especially when a child reaches school-going age or with the expansions of things like preschools. And so, why should we care about this? So I imagine many of the other panelists think that these patterns are inherently of interest, but there's also substantial evidence that the continuity of female labor supply, the level, and the timing are main contributors to the gender pay gap. And so in this paper, we hope to contribute to this literature on gender differences in labor supply by documenting 5 empirical facts and focusing in particular on summer work interruptions for women. So first, we investigate whether female labor supply varies throughout the year. And we document that women's labor supply drops during the summer months, whereas we do not see a similar drop among men. So this is kind of the main fact that we highlight in this paper. And then the subsequent facts are designed to kind of unpack or shed light on some of the mechanisms that might be driving this main fact. So then we document that this drop in female labor supply during the summer months is more pronounced among women with children, and in particular, married women with children. We further document that this drop in female labor supply during the summer months is concentrated among mothers with school-age children, in particular children 6 to 12 years old who might require supervision during the summer during school closures. Using separate time use data, we document that during the summer months, there is a contemporaneous increase in the total time spent on childcare by mothers. There's also an increase among fathers, but the increase is larger among mothers than among fathers. Finally, we have some preliminary evidence on the role of sectoral sorting in explaining this gender gap in summer labor supply. And so we document that this drop is partially explained by the fact that men and women tend to work in different sectors. In particular, women are more likely to work in the education sector, which tracks the school year, but it's not completely explained by this. And so we offer a couple of interpretations. So we think that this set of facts is consistent with female employment responding to, being I would say, the drop in female employment being a real-time response to predictable school closures during summer. So in addition, we have a more preliminary interpretation that there could be anticipatory sorting of women into jobs, occupations, or sectors that offer this summer flexibility. Okay, so next I'll jump into the data, definitions, and specification. So we use the CPS Basic Monthly Survey from 1989 to 2019, and we limit our sample to prime age working individuals, so individuals ages 25 to 49. We focus on 2 labor supply outcomes, and these are both pertaining to the reference week of the survey, which is usually the second week of the month. So first we have labor force participation, which is just a binary variable, which takes on a value of 1 if the individual is in the labor force and 0 otherwise. And second, we have employment, which takes on a value of 1 if the individual is employed in the reference week, and takes on a value of 0 if the individual is unemployed or not a labor market or not a labor force participant. We use the following regression specification to estimate seasonal patterns in labor supply. And here we have our dependent variable, so the labor supply outcome for individual I in time period T. And our independent variables are a set of month fixed effects where we're going to omit May, so May will be the reference month. And in addition, we're going to include a linear spline with knots at business cycle peaks and troughs. And this is designed to control for business cycle fluctuations alongside secular trends. We cluster our standard errors at the individual level, which accounts for the fact that the CPS sampling frame interviews individuals multiple times. And we're going to estimate this specification separately for men and women. All right, so next I'll jump into the results, and all of the results are going to be displayed in graphs of a very similar form. And so here what we have on the x-axis is months. And so since we normalize everything to May, so May is the leftmost month. And then what we plot here are the month fixed effects, so the coefficients on the month fixed effects. And so the first piece of evidence that I want to offer is actually on transitions out of the labor force. And so what we observe here in this blue line is that female labor force exits, so transitions from the labor force to out of the labor force, spike during the summer months. So what we observe is that there's an increased propensity of women to exit the labor force during the summer months. And in contrast, in this green trend line, what we observe is that there is, I would say, much more attenuated seasonal variation in male labor force exits, so throughout the year. So next I'll turn to just focusing on women, how these exits from the labor force during the summer months contribute to a female drop in summer labor supply. So first I'll just focus on this is the level of female labor force participation relative to May. So this is plotted in this blue line. And so what we observe is that female labor force participation from May to July drops by 0.5 percentage points. I also want to point out that there is elevated female labor force participation in the fall. And while the focus of this paper is going to be really gender differences in labor supply during the summer months, we suspect that this elevated labor force participation of women in the fall is likely attributed to labor demand features such as increased retail hiring during the fall months. In addition to the decline in female labor force participation during the summer months, we observe, so here in the orange line, increased female unemployment during the summer months, okay? And so the combination of the decline in female labor force participation and the increase in female unemployment during the summer months contributes to a steep decline in female employment in this green line during the summer months. So I'll just say a little bit about magnitudes. So what we observe here is that from May to July, there's about a 1 percentage point decline in female employment. And to put this in perspective, so during the Great Recession, so among prime age female workers, there was a decline in the employment to population rate of about 4 percentage points. And so this seasonal variation that we document in this paper is about a quarter of that decline. All right. So next, what I want to do is kind of unpack this fact, this decline in female employment during the summer months. And so the first cut that we'll do is by household structure. So we'll divide women by marital status, whether they're married or unmarried, and whether they have an own child under 18 present in the household or not. And so what we observe here is that the presence of a child, of your own child under 18 in the household, serves to amplify this drop in female employment during the summer months. And this holds within both married women and unmarried women, although we see that the drop is most pronounced among married women with children. So we see this as kind of the first piece of evidence that perhaps increased childcare obligations during the summer months are contributing to this gender difference in labor supply. So next I want to drill down a little bit deeper into how the drop in female employment differs by the age of the child in the household. So here, what we observe is that the drop in female employment during the summer months is most pronounced among women whose youngest child is ages 6 to 12. And so these are children who are going to experience school closures during the summer and also require some supervision. In contrast, we see that the drop is more attenuated among mothers whose youngest child is under 6, where childcare probably experiences less seasonal variation, and also mothers whose youngest child is 13 to 17, who still experience school closures during the summer, but probably require less direct supervision from parents. And in fact, these latter two groups, so mothers of very young children and slightly older children, experience a drop in employment that is quite similar to women with no child under 18 present in their household. So next, we turn to a different survey, the American Time Use Survey, from years 2004 to 2019 to further explore whether increased childcare obligations during summer can contribute to this female drop in summer labor supply. And here we start off by just looking at primary childcare time. So this is childcare as a primary activity, the primary or the main use of one's time. And we plot this series for both mothers and fathers of children ages 6 to 12. And perhaps somewhat counterintuitively, we observe that there is a drop in primary childcare time during the summer months among both mothers and fathers, and the drop is actually a bit bigger among mothers and than among fathers. And we suspect that this drop in primary childcare time is due to the fact that one's main use of time when attending to childcare often pertains to education-related activities, such as helping children with their homework, driving children to school. So when we turn to thinking about or turn to investigating total childcare time, which includes both primary and secondary activities, where a secondary activity is you're doing childcare while doing something else like household chores or watching television, we see among mothers and fathers of young children, there is a sharp increase in total childcare time during the summer months. And the increase is larger among mothers than among fathers, which is consistent with the notion that female employment is dropping during the summer months in order to attend to increased childcare demands. And one thing I'll say is that there is much more granularity to the American Time Use Survey than we have currently exploited in this analysis. And one thing that we particularly look forward to doing is looking at how time use, childcare time use varies during the day and over the course of the week, and how this compares during the summer months relative to the rest of the year. So finally, we want to provide just some preliminary evidence on the role of sectoral sorting in explaining this drop in female labor supply during the summer months. And so here we plot, so this is just women again, and these are exits from employment to non-employment. So in the rest of the year relative to May, and we divide this up by individuals who have previously worked in the education sector and individuals who have not worked in the education sector. And perhaps unsurprisingly, we find that there is a sharp increase in transitions from employment in the education sector to non-employment during the summer months. But what I want to note is that individuals who do not work in education, so whose work schedules do not closely track the school year, also experience an increase in these transitions from employment to non-employment during the summer months. So we think that sectoral sorting, in particular, the fact that women are more likely to work in education than are men, can explain much, but not necessarily all of this summer drop in female labor supply. And another thing I'll say is that the fact that more women work in education than men could also be an endogenous reaction to the notion that there are increased childcare obligations during the summer months. And so we hope to do kind of much more to explore the role of occupational and sectoral sorting in explaining the drop in female labor supply during summer. So just to conclude, in this paper, we document there is a summer drop in female labor supply that is not observed among men, that occurs primarily among mothers, in particular among mothers of school-age children who are ages 6 to 12. And it's not completely explained by women working in education more so than men. So our preliminary interpretation is that this drop in female employment during the summer months is a response to actual school closures during the summer. So a response to kind of an immediate demand for more childcare during the summer months. And I would say more suggestively, it could also be a response to anticipated school closures during the summer. So women kind of looking ahead, understanding that in the future, they may experience this increased childcare obligation during the summer months and may sort into certain jobs or occupations accordingly. So we have many next steps in this project, as you can imagine. And so as I mentioned earlier, we would like to explore the role of occupational and sectoral sorting and explaining these gender differences in summer labor supply. We would also like to kind of push a little bit harder on the role of childcare availability in explaining the female drop in summer labor supply. We have already have some preliminary evidence on the evolution of this drop in female labor supply over the life cycle. And then finally, bring this back to kind of the motivation and the introduction, we would like to understand the ramifications of these kind of repeated yearly interruptions in labor force participation for the gender pay gap. So thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Melanie. So our discussant is Colleen.
Okay. Sorry, I do have some slides actually. Okay, can you guys see this?
We see it, yeah.
Okay. So thank you, Melanie, and Brendan for this paper. I was really excited to look at it. It was fun to see all the pictures. And I think it was nice to actually see some documentation of maybe a regularity that we think was out there, right? So we probably expected this to be present, but I think it was really eye-opening to look at the magnitude and also how you compared it to just the size of, a 1 percentage point drop. Is that large? And yeah, it actually is. And then also for those groups with children of the ages 6 to 12, I mean, that was really sizable in terms of the changes in labor force participation. So, and things that I was thinking about, which I know you guys are probably as well, is just this concept of supply or demand, right? So we're looking at this pattern of labor force participation that we're seeing in the data, but to what extent can we disentangle kind of supply side factors versus demand side factors? And so it sounds like you're trying to dig further into kind of care availability and other things to think about the supply side. But I also was wondering, just in terms of the demand side for female labor, is it the case that some of these, to what extent, it would be nice to know, to what extent is this a demand side factor in some of these more kind of seasonal academic or school calendar type jobs? Are they just more open to women and having this serial pattern of career interruptions? How does that fit into the demand side? Are there certain types of employers or jobs for which that's kind of accepting? However, in other contexts, like we know from the professional, more corporate ladders, having career interruptions is really devastating for your career. So I think there's just an interesting interplay between, we kind of have this predictable pattern of career interruptions and reemployment, and kind of what does that look like for the careers of those individuals? And as you're also thinking about the longer term consequences, which I'll get to in a second. So I think I'd like to know a little bit more also about the hours, right? So you're looking at the 0-1 aspect, right? But I wonder, are we also just seeing a downshift in hours as well, even though individuals are maintaining employment? So I'm not sure if you can look at that in your data as well. I was trying to figure out why we see kind of this persistence. I think it makes, for the school, the connection to school, having these exits at June, but then why do we also have exits in July and August? So I was just trying to understand that more, and if you have any insight into that, as well as whether these are it would be great to know if it was, the employment was just ending because a lot of these women are on kind of 9-month contracts, or, whether they're just exiting from an existing job and then that position is then filled, let's say, by a different worker, as compared to being just left kind of vacant until the fall. For the implications, you're starting to get that at the end of your presentation in terms of, how does this interruptions in terms of not only on an annual basis influence the, differences in earnings between men and women, but I'm also thinking about retirement, because some of my research is on employer provided retirement benefits. And I'm just thinking that, if these are, workers in their 30s, and they're missing out on kind of 9 or 3 months of contributions to their retirement every year, and this is compounding over time. I mean, these could be really large effects on total wealth, right? So I think I would go beyond just looking at, even the annualized effects, but thinking about the lifetime effects, because I think that could be quite substantial. And yeah, so my comment about career interruptions is kind of trying to understand if this kind of exit is kind of part of the job, or is it, or does it have different, or like the larger career consequences for pay as we see in other contexts. And then I was thinking about education, and if it was to what extent these were more or less 9-month contracts, and if it's kind of built into the contract itself, does that kind of ameliorate any of these longer term consequences that we might be concerned about? For example, if it's some type of education field, then maybe do benefits or contributions to retirement continue during that time period, even though they're not kind of employed? So I think thinking about to what, where this is happening in the labor market, and how are the other institutions or contracts potentially offsetting these patterns. Like for teachers, for example, their pay oftentimes just a function of education and tenure, right? So like you're having career interruptions in the education space may not be so consequential. And so, these could be education aides, so not necessarily teachers, but maybe it's a similar type remuneration process. I'm glad they're going to continue to look at the time use data, because I think that was kind of interesting how, like you mentioned, it was kind of opposite of what you'd expect at some point, in some ways, of like you'd expect, the primary care time to be increasing during these months, and then it's actually decreasing, but then total time use. So I just trying to understand more about kind of what's happening in these summer months compared to other months. Then also, the father's time is going up quite a lot as well. And so how are they, having that increased time allocation, but still remaining their employment ties? And then you kind of made a distinction between kind of expected versus actual school closures in the interpretation. I was just trying to understand the importance of distinguishing between those two for the interpretation. I think that's all I have.
Thank you, Colleen. There are a few questions coming in, but Melanie and Jason, if you would like to answer this first, and I can ask the remaining questions later.
Yeah, absolutely. Colleen, thank you so much for that amazing discussion, especially from a slide deck. I really appreciate it. And so I think that you hit on so many wonderful points. And so I just want to take, I would say, one moment to respond. And so I think, absolutely, we would love to distinguish between labor demand and labor supply factors. I agree we were a bit loose with our language here in terms of framing everything in terms of labor supply. There's absolutely a role for labor demand. My co-author Brendan actually has kind of a broader agenda exploring seasonal variation in the labor market, focusing quite a lot on these labor demand factors. And this is something that we can absolutely try to kind of pick apart in the future, partly by kind of leveraging more kind of like sectoral and occupational variation in the data. I completely agree that we should focus on the intensive margin as well as the extensive margin of labor force participation. We do have some kind of preliminary results on hours that didn't make it into this presentation. Hours is, yeah, so we're absolutely in agreement on that. And then, trying to understand the nature of these contracts, whether, women are simply in jobs that have these 9-month contracts or that, tend to end in June or July, I think is like paramount for, understanding our project, and is something that, I think many of us are kind of familiar with teachers, where that's often the case with them. And so for us, exploring just the kind of education, non-education divide was like a first pass at this, but I agree that there's like so much more that can be done there. I agree with the long-term effects as well. How, what are the ramifications of these repeated interruptions? Maybe it's none. If it is, built into this contract, maybe it's substantial. If women are kind of interrupting their career trajectories every year in order to accommodate increased childcare demands during the summer. And then just kind of a final note on the importance of distinguishing between this like real-time response versus like an anticipatory response. I guess I think about kind of a real-time response as you realize kind of in the moment that your childcare obligations have gone up, and so you have to exit the labor force or quit your job in order to attend to that. I think about the anticipatory response as you kind of forecasting that in the future you may encounter these increased childcare obligations during the summer months, and so you may make occupational, sectoral, or job choices consistent with that kind of demand. And so this kind of links to the literature on like the broader demand for temporal flexibility among women and how they may have like a willingness to pay in terms of their wages or other job attributes in order to kind of gain access to that type of flexibility. So that's what I was thinking about there. Yeah. And then, sorry, we can get to the other questions, which I haven't had a chance to read.
No, I've been trying to collect some of the questions from the chat and the Q&A.
So I was planning to type answers to those in a moment. I wanted to just quickly, following on Melanie, first of all, Colleen, thank you. Those are really helpful remarks and include some things we really haven't thought about. So I mean, your point, for example, about pension contributions is not something that was on my radar at least, and that's a add that to the list of reasons why this could be a consequential phenomenon. One thing I just wanted to add, you raised the question of why we see labor force exits persisting in beyond June. I think there's kind of two reasons in my mind for that. One is the sort of granular timing of the CPS reference week. So June in the CPS is going to be the second week of June, or the week containing the 12th. And in many parts of the country, schools are still going to be in session during the time. So when I was growing up, I mean, I still would have been in school during the CPS reference week. And so July is the first month for at least for some households where you'd see kind of schools out. And the second, I think, is that if you kind of think about that, some of this phenomenon is also playing out in the context of, you imagine kind of a frictional search model where some people are sort of deliberately deciding, okay, I'm going to work now, I'm not going to work now. But there's other people who are churning in and out of jobs. You happen to get a layoff in August, for example, and maybe I had been getting childcare during July and sort of paying the extra premium to be able to continue working in July. Now I lose my job in August. Maybe I defer a job search for a few weeks because why would I want to, why not just hold off on my search for a few weeks? So I think in a frictional model, you would expect some kind of a bit of convexification of that kind of pattern. So those are just two things I wanted to add. I guess if we do, Anders, if we do have time for answering the questions in the chat.
We do have 4 more minutes. I picked up one of the questions and I think it's really interesting. I mean, what does this look like in other countries? There are some countries who have shifted holiday schedules relative to the US. I'm thinking, I mean, the chat is mentioning Japan, so that's Jasmine Thomas's question. I was thinking about Australia. I mean, there you would see similar systems, but maybe patterns could be similar or different.
Yeah, that's such a great question. So we have zero evidence on that that we've produced. Sorry, I have not done like a comprehensive review of the literature, but if you all know of papers in an international setting that do explore this within year variation in female labor supply or labor force participation, we would really welcome those suggestions.
Even within the states, there may be some variations regionally. So I think that might be interesting. Some areas you have shorter break, or even more. Some school districts provide some rich summer programs or something like this. The supply drop may respond differently to those things. And I think that it's really interesting stuff going on. And Japan just has a very short break. So that may be conducive for career development of Japanese women, but of course husbands are doing the rat race, so it may not help. But another thing is, maybe the grandparents nearby, so that kind of stuff. And then lastly, this immigrant, right? Local immigrants are available nearby, so you don't have to quit.
Yeah,
so
these are
there's
all
a lot of interesting issues that you can delve into from this.
Yeah, I completely agree. Yeah, thank you for all those suggestions, Takao. I really appreciate it. Yeah, we had thought about leveraging some state variation in year-round school year versus kind of a more traditional school year. And there is a literature that looks kind of more broadly about the ramifications of a year-round school year for female labor supply. But to our knowledge, it hasn't yet looked at kind of this seasonal variation as an outcome. And so that's something that's kind of on our radar, but we haven't yet had the opportunity to explore. And then also, alongside our interest in kind of looking at how the availability of childcare, in particular more inexpensive childcare, affects this pattern, we will definitely look at the Cortez and Pan paper for that.
There are two more comments, so I don't know if there are questions before we move on to the next paper. And one is by Yang Song, who spotted a difference in the transitions into unemployment versus out of the labor force. So that is telling us something about what is really going on when women leave the labor force.
Yeah, so so I guess my read of the data is that we do see I would say decline in labor force participation, female labor force participation during the summer months. We also see an increase in female unemployment during the summer months. And so both of these are contributing to the decline in female employment to population rate during the summer months. So the rise in female unemployment, I think, is a bit larger in magnitude than the decline in female labor force participation, but I see both of these as contributing to the decline in female employment.
Yeah. The last question I picked up is by Wu, actually, who's looking at you now, which is about the contracts offered to men and women, if there are any sort of significant differences, if we know that in what type of contracts are offered, pointing at short-term contracts for women and more permanent contracts for men. It's probably something you can look into if you can find data on this.
Yeah, so we haven't looked at that at all, and so I don't know the answer to that question, but it's such a great suggestion, and it's something that we can definitely try to follow up on.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Time is up, so we're moving on to the last paper of the session. So Marcy, the time is yours.
Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Perfect. So good afternoon, everyone. I'll be presenting a paper on the return of migration for Caribbean women in the United States, and it's a case study of selected countries in the Caribbean region. Whoops. All right. So the aim of the study is to gain further insight on skilled female migration. Women comprise of approximately 48% of all international migrant stock, and the proportion of women with regards to the total immigrant stock varies across region. And so given that there's some unique trends as it relates to the Caribbean region, I thought that it'd be really good to look at the specific region. One, because they have the highest immigration rates in the world compared to other regions. Secondly, the rates of immigration to the United States compared to the female-male ratio between male and female, that in terms of stocks in the United States, the women supersede that. So we see on average women migrating more than men to the United States compared to in this case. And so, sorry. And so I think given that these two things, one, they have the highest immigration rate in the world, and that women are migrating more than men, I want to look further into the reasoning behind that, but also to look at a specific policy that may affect their decision making. And so usually the proportion of women among all international migration varies across region. The participation of women in migration depends on the social roles of women, their autonomy and the capacity to make decisions, their access to resources, and the existing gender stratification in countries of origin and destination. And so given that, while there are a number of benefits related to international migration, it can adversely affect the development of countries through the loss of essential human resources, often referred to as brain drain, as well as through the depletion of the national labor force due to movements of all skill levels. A number of Caribbean countries are listed among those with the highest immigration rates in the world. That include Guyana, Jamaica, Barbados, Trinidad and Tobago, and Belize. And according to Mishra, the total losses due to skilled migration outweigh the benefits when it comes to the Caribbean region. For countries such as Jamaica, the losses are up to 20% of the GDP. And so given that the Caribbean region is losing a mass exodus of professionals, particularly women in health and education, I think this is a very important question, understanding why women are choosing to migrate outside the region. And we may know some of those reasons, such as wage differentials, but understanding if there's a way we can curb that brain drain that is currently happening. According to Dr. the conditions under which a country gains or loses are not beyond its control. To a large extent, it depends on the policy it adopts. And so that will largely be dependent on the country's characteristics, etc. And so we want to look more deeper into first understanding why there is an outflow of so many women leaving the Caribbean region, and then figuring out if there are certain policies that can stop this migration trend. So there are a number of studies that have already looked at skilled female migration. And so I'm just going to do a quick overview of the main determinants that I've looked at in terms of migration, reasons why women that determine skilled migration outside from a developing to a developed country. And Dupont et al. Finds that while women with primary education attainment do not have significantly different probability of migrating than their male counterparts, those with tertiary education have the highest probability of migrating. So women that have high tertiary education are more likely to move outside of the region to a developed country. And then also Dr. et al. 2009 finds that the size of the country and the level of development will affect the decision to migrate for women. So they find that huge differences were observed in regions where women had poor access to education and they were poor developed. So the less developed the country was, the more likely women were to migrate outside of that country. It was also found that women's migration intentions were negatively related to having dependent children. So for De Jong 2000, he found that if in terms of household characteristics, if there were dependent children and elderly adults in the households, women were less likely to migrate, where this was the opposite for men. Zaltnik, 1995, found that in addition to household characteristics, social and economic characteristics, immigration policies also played into a role in either attracting or reducing the number of female migrants coming from a particular region. Countries like the United States, whose immigration policies favor family unification, have a higher female-male ratio of international migrants. And so there has been a lot of studies that have looked at skilled migration and what the push and pull factors for these skilled migration rates. And so the way that I'm contributing to this study, or the way I'm contributing to this existing literature on migration, is that I'm looking at a select group of countries that are known for high levels of brain drain, right? So the Caribbean region has the highest immigration rates in the world, but it also suffers from high levels of brain drain. Given that there's a recent policy that was implemented within the region, I want to test whether or not this policy is helping to reduce that brain drain. And I'll tell you a little bit more about that policy in a minute. But more importantly, when I first ran the regression just to look at skilled migration, what I found is a unique trend as it relates to women, which I'll also talk about more. So one, I know there's already existing literature that looks at skilled migration, but what we're adding to this literature is that they are sending countries policies that may help to reduce that brain drain, and we want to test if that is possible. And so I'm going to try my best to, examine the policy and see how it impacts the decision for women to migrate. And so the question is, does the Caribbean Single Market and Economy Labor Mobility Policy influence the self-selection of Caribbean female migrants to the United States? So what we're observing here is that we're observing women that have already migrated, but we want to see in terms of if skilled women, probability that a woman being skilled is coming into the United States after policy that has been implemented that is trying to retain the women to stay in the Caribbean. And so I know I just said the Caribbean Single Market and Economy Policy, and so many of you may not be familiar with that policy. And so what that policy is, the Caribbean has implemented a policy back in 2001 where they're trying to create a single market. And one of the protocols of the policy is that they are targeting specific categories of workers. And so in 2006, they are allowing free movement of university graduates. So if you have a tertiary education, you're allowed to move within the region to find a job And then in 2008, they implemented a policy which targets certain categories of workers, which I'll talk about some more. In 2010, they also implemented a policy by a smaller number of countries called the Organization of American States, Organization of Eastern Caribbean States, and they allowed free movement for 11 countries that are part of the Organization of American States, and they allow unimpeded movement of nationals from these member states. So again, the question is, given that this policy that was implemented, allowing unimpeded movement of university graduates for Caribbean nationals, men and women, how is that affecting their decision to move outside of the region to find employment, right? So right now we're primarily thinking about economic immigrants. And so you want to understand, given that this policy was implemented, and generally we know that many migrants are moving to the United States in search of work, how is that changing their decision to migrate? Okay, and so in terms of, so there are two policies that I just mentioned. One is related to CARICOM, and that's for those countries, I'm considering 11 countries, and of those 11 countries, these categories of workers are allowed to move freely within the region without requiring a work permit, right? So they've created one economic unit, and you're allowed to move in the country. And so these include university graduates, media workers, artists, musicians, sports persons, teachers, etc. So the occupations that we're considering in this study is university graduates and media workers. We're also considering teachers and nurses because we know women are more likely to self-select into teachers and nurses. And so given that we're considering this policy, before going into this, so I feel like I'm not fully explaining this. So the question is that we want to see whether or not when this policy intervention occurred, whether skilled immigrants who are targeted by this regional policy is choosing to stay or leave in the region when they consider the overall net benefit. Okay, and so in order to really test this, I first adopted the neoclassical theory of migration. And so what happened in this theory, it says potential migrants estimate the costs and benefits of moving to alternative international locations and migrate to where the expected discount net returns are greatest over some horizon. So at time negative X, the net benefit function is the same for both treated and untreated countries. So in my sample, I include countries that are individuals who are from the treated countries and from the untreated countries. So I want to test, given that at time negative X, they all face the same net benefit function, right? And so they're making a calculation as to whether or not the overall benefit is positive to leave and find work outside of the region, or it is to stay within the region, right? At time X, a treated individual's cost benefit calculation is as follows. And so here, ZI is the non-monetary cost associated with moving. C1 is the direct cost, such as expenses to move to the United States. C2, and this equation looks at specifically at policies, receiving countries' policies as relates to the United States. And then C3 is what is the difference between at time negative X and X. And we want to isolate this variable to see what is going on in terms of how it's affecting the decision to, how is it affecting the skilled individual decision to move within the region. So given that there's this new cost associated with moving, so the opportunity cost of not using this policy to stay in the region to find a job compared to moving to the United States. And so in order to, so that was the theoretical framework that was adopted to test whether or not this policy was effective in this change in skill composition to the United States, given the policy was implemented. A panel data set of 15 countries was created across 17 years. 11 member states of CARICOM and CARICOM was included. And of these 11 member states, also, they are also members of the OECS. So the other policy that we talked about. And then included in that, I included 4 control countries, which included India, Mexico, Bahamas, and Haiti. And so with this is, I use individual level data from the American Community Survey. And then that individual level survey data was merged with country level data. So the way that the data was filtered was by the place of birth. And then that individual level data was merged with country level data. And the data was pulled from a number of sources. And so a multivariate regression model is used to evaluate the likelihood that an individual is skilled given that he or she is migrated. So what we're looking at or we're observing is that I'm not able to observe the decision from from the host country to the destination country, what I'm able to observe is is what is happening after they migrated. So I'm trying to say, given that there's a policy intervention, what is the likelihood that they were skilled? And so the way I do that is that there's a dummy variable, 1 or 0, 1 if you're skilled and 0 otherwise. So if you're skilled, meaning if you have a tertiary level education, and 0 otherwise. And then a number of individual characteristics are included. So first, I ran it on all individual skill. I do not just include females, I include male and females. I include age, marital status, and then I include certain determinants that would have been established in the literature as in terms of determinants of migration. So I look at GDP per capita relative to the US, inequality, the working age population, the country population, distance, and then I include a weighted variable just because we did not weight the initial individual level sample data. I include a trend variable, and these are the immediate relative, family preference, H-1B visas are the ratios which we're trying to measure how much these receiving countries' policies, visa policies, affect the decision that a skilled individual will migrate to the United States. And then the variable of trend is the interactive term CSME. So the policy variable is a dummy variable. It indicates when the policy was implemented. This is a time trend variable, and this treated as 1 or 0 for countries. So 1 if you are part of that treated country, and 0 otherwise. And so the main term that we're trying to control for all the other determinants of migration. And the term that we're trying to unpack here is this interactive term. Okay, so in terms of the results, as mentioned previously, I ran a regression that included individuals from these treated, untreated countries. And I look at both males and females. What I found initially is that I saw that overall, there wasn't any positive correlation between, or significant correlation between female and high skill. What I found is that the variable of interest, the CSME effect, that policy variable that we're looking at to see how it affects the probability that an individual is high skilled or not after the policy intervention, it is not significant, statistically significant. However, when I decompose the data even more and I look at specific occupations, nurses and teachers, I find that it is statistically significant. So 2008, the first policy only affected university graduates. Then the policy was implemented in 2008 that expanded this unimpeded movement to nurses and teachers. And as I've seen in the literature, there has been a large movement in teachers and nurses outside of the region. When this new phase policy was implemented in 2008, we see that it's negative and statistically significant, right? So what we can interpret from that is that when this policy was implemented in 2008, there was a higher likelihood for nurses and teachers to utilize this inter-regional migration policy to stay within the region compared to moving to outside of the region to find a job. But what we're more concerned about is that given that we saw that women are more likely to be nurses and teachers, and this policy seems to be affecting them more, we want to look specifically at women and how they're making that decision. And so what I did is after running that initial regression, then I dropped all the male participants. And so what happens is that I notice when I rerun the regression, just including female, I see that for the initial policy that targeted university graduates, I see that it does affect women. So it seems that women who have tertiary education are less likely to migrate outside the region. I see that it affects women who are highly skilled and single more, but here we see that if you are highly skilled and single, you are less likely to move outside the region. And then in terms of the phase 1, we see that so this seems a bit confusing. So let me repeat myself here. So when the initial policy, which targeted university graduate, we see that the policy was effective in affecting highly skilled women, right? So we see that we want to assume that since this variable is negative and significant, that after the policy was implemented, they were less likely to choose to migrate outside the region. So you want to assume that they were utilizing the policy within the region. What this phase calls CSME effect phase 1 targeted specific categories of workers. What we find is that this policy wasn't necessarily effective for single skilled women. So after this policy was implemented, we found that there's a positive relationship between being highly skilled and moving outside of the region. And the way that I interpret it is that married women were more likely to utilize this policy, given that they may have a different net benefit function, meaning that they may there's maybe some non-monetary costs that may be associated to being married compared to single women. So in terms of, and so, okay, so what we saw that preliminarily, we assumed that given that we use that dummy variable or that binary variable to kind of assume whether or not they'll be skilled or unskilled given the policy intervention, what we see is that like if women are single, they're more likely to not utilize the policy because there's a lower cost in staying within moving outside the region compared to married women. So I wanted to further analyze how when we think about returns of migration, what that looks like for married women and single women. And so the Mensa equation is incorporated into this study to suggest that each additional year of education provides a private rate of return to schooling of 5 to 8%, ranging from a low 1% to more than 20% in some countries. So here, I'm not trying to understand the wage differentials. What I'm using the wages for is to use it as a proxy to measure skill selectivity after the policy intervention, right? And so here, what I'm doing is that I'm able to kind of observe the wages once they've migrated. So I'm looking at the flow of immigrants. I'm able to see, okay, at point X, when they migrated, what was their wages. And I want to see if there's a wage differential after the policy intervention. And so this variable here, the CSME effect initial, what we're trying to see is that after the policy was implemented, if more skilled women were likely to stay within the region, we should see a positive relationship between the log wages and this interactive variable, here. And so what we do see is a negative, we see it's negative and significant, which I would like to assume again, but with that people that are more high skilled were choosing to stay within the region after the policy was implemented. So
Marcy, the time is running, so if you can
sure, yeah. So just to round up, so regional arrangements may help. So overall, what I found, and this still is a preliminary results, and I still need to do some more robustness tests. Regional arrangements may help to retain talent and reduce brain drain. The CSME policy did seem to reduce the loss of essential human capital, i.e. teachers and nurses. The extension of policy which targeted teachers and nurses were less likely to be used by single Caribbean women. The policy intervention did not seem to increase high skill selectivity in the United States. So overall, we see that the policy did seem to affect certain categories of worker, especially women who were more likely to fit into those particular roles. And we did see that the policy did seem to be effective in reducing the number of women coming to the United States. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Colleen, we have 8 minutes left, so please.
Yep. Okay, sorry. Okay, so thank you, Marcy, for this opportunity to read your paper. So I think, what we were trying to do is to assess the effect of a free movement policy on the proportion of women migrants who are skilled coming from the Caribbean. And so looking specifically at this law change and then, or the free movement policy, and then looking at these different groups of occupations and basically evaluating the change in the proportion. I think the proportion of skilled migrants in the post-period relative to the pre-period is the primary analysis. And so I think, just in terms of comments, when I was reading the paper and then also in the presentation, I think it's important to maybe tie your question a little bit tighter to the policy and bringing that more up front. I think maybe it's my perspective in that I'm not as, familiar with the policy, but I think, what you're getting at is really interesting to see, what can these countries do, these sourcing countries do to potentially mitigate this draw or this brain drain, this pull to other economies. And so I think just being more explicit up front, I think currently it's pitched as, just to better understand migration decisions, but I think you can be more precise with that. and then further enriching the information and description of that free movement policy. I guess I was trying to understand, the rationale for why the policy would be more relevant for high skilled versus low skilled workers. And I didn't feel like I grasped that as much as I could. And then also the question I had in my mind is this is a regional movement policy, but if I'm thinking about a particular host or source country, is this still an issue in terms of brain drain from that one country? So I guess trying to understand this idea of countries kind of banding together to protect a region, but still maybe suffering some individual country level brain drain if there's that movement within the region itself. So kind of helping the reader kind of understand that tension a little bit more. So I was really interested in this gender aspect. In your paper, you say that it really starts the conceptual framework by saying that this migration is a gendered process. I found that really intriguing, and I would just wanted you to enrich that a little bit more. You kind of list a number of factors that could have gender differences, but I felt like it could be further enriched to really ground that in, what is the gendered aspect. I mean, it was more obvious to me in terms of the household aspect, so the role of dependence and marital status in determining migration decisions. To me, just was easier to see the gender connection in terms of, typical household roles, as well as the pull factors that you mentioned in terms of the feminization of different sectors. But I would like to see more, and for these other factors, if you're really going to say that migration is this kind of gendered process. And then how might this inform your empirical approach? I mean, I think you're starting to get at that when you're looking, let's say, at, high skilled combined with marital status, right? But I think just being more explicit about how these factors are important, what varies by gender and what doesn't, and then mapping that explicitly to your empirical approach in your tests. And in terms of your empirical approach, it seems like it's a large part of this is a difference in difference approach. And I guess I was just wanting to hear more about the underlying assumptions there. In particular, in your kind of the Borja style model, you do have the differences in wages as kind of one of that decision factors. And then I was wondering how that plays into your ability to kind of claim that the differences that you find are due to the policy as compared to other factors. So I was thinking that given the economic conditions, the Great Recession that happened in the US and elsewhere in the world, like how that might influence these migration decisions concurrently with the policy change. So just kind of helping understand the assumptions underlying your identification and how you might be able to do, what you might be able to do about it to understand to what extent that other factors are going on or other changes are going on. So those are my overall comments.
Thank you, Colleen. And Marcy, you will get the opportunity to reply. Let me just say we are a few minutes before they cut us off. And I just want to thank Colleen and Julie for setting up this workshop and all the speakers as well. And thank you for all the comments coming from the participants. I think this has been a great workshop. So Marcy, you get the last minutes and then they're going to cut us off eventually. So the time is yours.
Hey, Colleen, thank you for those feedback. I'll definitely incorporate those and just kind of be more, like you said, specific in terms of my question and like in terms of my specification of my model. So thank you for that feedback.
Okay. Then we have time for one more question. Otherwise, let's just finish here. It has been a pleasure being the chair of the session, and I hope that next time we can meet in person in Chicago or Paris or Tokyo or Minnesota or many other places. So thank you so much for making this an interesting workshop.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you,
Thank
Anders.
you.
Thanks,
Thanks for organizing. Thanks, everyone.
everyone.
This was fun.
Take care.